Hey, welcome everybody. I can't believe it's our fourth session of 5 sessions. And I just want to say thanks again to the Sign Institute and for the opportunity to be with all of you. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. Hey, it's going to be a great discussion today. I can't wait to welcome my good friend, Colonel Joel Rayburn, who had a distinguished career in our Army. We served a lot of time together in places like Afghanistan and in Iraq. Joel is a Middle East expert who taught Middle East history at the United States Military Academy at West Point. He has his history master's degree from Texas A&M University, and he's written, I think, the most important and insightful book about Iraqi politics, which is pretty hard to understand. Joel makes it understandable, and he also led the seminal study of the U.S. Army's experience in Iraq from 2003 to 2011. I think it is the best official history ever done for the U.S. military. So Joel and we had an opportunity to serve together, as I mentioned, in Afghanistan, Iraq, and then he went on to really have a huge impact on U.S. policy toward the Middle East as a senior director on the National Security Council staff. We got to serve together there when I was National Security Advisor. And then he went on to be the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Levant Affairs at the State Department, and then the Special Envoy for Syria, which you know is a horrible humanitarian tragedy. And he did his best to help resolve that conflict, to address the humanitarian catastrophe and get to a sustainable and secure solution for the Syrian people and the people of the region. So Joel is a great warrior as an officer, and he's a humanitarian, and he's a diplomat, and we're gonna have a great discussion with him. Now, the topic today is rebutting retrenchment, this idea that the United States should withdraw essentially from commitments abroad because our withdrawal from those commitments abroad would be an unmitigated good. Many argue these days that, hey, we need to end what they call endless wars. And they see actually our presence abroad as the driver of those conflicts. But what I would like us to consider is that kind of interpretation of the nature of these competitions abroad is fundamentally arrogant because it doesn't acknowledge the agency that the other has, our rivals, our enemies, our adversaries in particular, over the future, the authorship that they have over the future. In this view, this argument for disengagement, the other really has no aspirations except in reaction to us, no aspirations of their own. And so I think it's important for us to consider really several aspects of our engagement abroad. First is to try to understand what is the true nature of the challenges that we're facing. And I think that we should focus on the Middle East because this is where you most often hear this argument, right? There's a view that, hey, the Middle East is really just mainly a mess to be avoided, right? I mean, what are we doing there? Trillions of dollars and years of conflict and the cost and blood and treasure in the Middle East. But I think it's important for us to understand first of all what is the nature of the security challenge from the Middle East, and I tend to think of this as this challenge as mainly a sectarian civil war in the region, where you have a cycle of violence associated with that sectarian civil war that is driving conflict, and it is in large measure fear, fear of Iranian-backed militias, for example, who are advancing Iran's agenda across the region. And that agenda is to keep, I believe, the Arab world perpetually weak and enmeshed in conflict, so Iran can extend its influence across the region. Can it push the United States out as the first step, in threatening the little Satan, from Iran's perspective, Israel, with destruction, and then gaining hegemonic influence across the region. This is the exportation of the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Sometimes it's framed as a defensive, forward defense, but it's really profoundly offensive in nature. And the way that Iran is perpetuating the cycle of violence is through proxy forces across the region. We see that dramatically, obviously, in Lebanon, a state that is in complete free fall with Iran's support for Hezbollah. And what Iran does is it tries to now apply the Hezbollah model more broadly across the Middle East. And what that model is basically, do you have a weak government in power that is dependent on Iran for support, but Iran grows militias outside of that government's control that can be turned against that government if it acts against Iranian interests. You see that this is certainly the dynamic in Syria, where the Assad regime, as it engages in these serial episodes of mass murder, that is the Syrian civil war, is reliant on an Iranian proxy army. You see this in Iraq, where Iran is doing its best to subvert the sovereignty of the Iraqi government and effect really state capture over state institutions and functions as it grows a militia. These PMF forces, outside of the government's control, and you can see that design in Yemen as well with the Houthis. Well, if you think about it, what does that say to Sunni Arab populations who feel beleaguered, based on the strength of these militias? Well, they think we have to defend ourselves, and we can't do it through a political process because our government's subverted. So what we need to do is to defend ourselves with force of arms. And then that allows terrorist organizations to portray themselves as patrons and protectors of these beleaguered Sunni communities. And you begin to see how this cycle of violence empowers Iran across the region, but also empowers jihadist terrorist organizations who draw on this cycle of violence for strength and support as well. And so I would say that to answer the question of, okay, what the heck do we care? Why do we care about the Middle East? Why is it more than just a mess to be avoided? I would say that there are two fundamental reasons for that. Problems that originate in the Middle East don't stay there, right? The Middle East does not adhere to Las Vegas rules, right? And you see that certainly with jihadist terrorist organizations. You see that, I think, you can see it starkly in the case of the rise of ISIS, right? Al Qaeda in Iraq 2.0, a group that was able to gain tremendous strength, to take control of territory the size of Britain, and to export terrorism to Europe and to attempt to do so in the United States as well, and globally. You see the risk of disengaging associated with that period of time in particular. So the first reason we should care about the Middle East is the problems that develop there don't stay there. The second reason is, I would say that just when you think, okay, it can't get worse in the Middle East, it actually can get worse in the Middle East. And I think that an example of that is the Syrian civil war and how that developed against the backdrop of our desire to disengage. And under the theory that, well, we can just kind of contain that conflict, it won't get worse. Well, of course, half of the Syrian population is dead, wounded, or displaced. The Syrian civil war has created this humanitarian catastrophe, as I mentioned, that has affected countries in the region, but also has affected Europe, and also has magnified the problem set associated with jihadist terrorist organizations, now who are orders of magnitude larger than the Mujahideen era alumni of the resistance to Soviet occupation in Afghanistan, who then became part of the core of Al Qaeda, who then committed the most devastating terrorist attack in history on September 11th, 2001. So the point that I'd like to make today to all of you is to learn about the Middle East, think about what our interests are, think about how we can advance American interests, but I think the interests of all humanity in a way that is sustainable and in a way that is reasoned and prioritizes our interests and recognizes, we can't solve the problems of the Middle East, but also our disengagement wouldn't make it any better. And we can support a long-term approach to the Middle East that begins to arrest this cycle of violence, that allows the people of the region to get over the horrible suffering that they've experienced in recent decades, and to get on a path to security and stability over time. And I think that approach is diplomatic, but it has to be enabled by military efforts in the region as well. Well, and finally, before I introduce Joel, I would like to just say that, hey, it's not all bad news in the Middle East, right? And when there's good news, we ought to celebrate it. And I think that the recent Abraham Accords, the normalization of relations between United Arab Emirates and Bahrain initially, and then followed by Sudan and Morocco, I think that is a really important initiative that deserves reinforcement. And why is it important? Well, first of all, if you think about this cycle of violence, this helps arrest that cycle of violence because there's a recognition that, hey, the Arab states' interests, security interests, are really aligned with those of Israel in large measure because the main threat to security is Iran's 4-decade-long proxy war that they have been waging in the region. And the second reason is if you have the people of the Abrahamic religions coming together under the Abraham Accords, what it does is it communicates to everybody, hey, we are all people of the book. And if jihadist terrorists try to say that they're engaged in a war of religion, you can see that lie. And you can see that really these jihadist terrorist organizations are criminals because they use a criminal act, mass murder, as their principal tactic against all humanity. And they are engaged in terrorism to accomplish a political objective, which I would say is an irreligious objective, and certainly their tactics are irreligious, and they try to, despite their efforts to try to cloak themselves in a perverted interpretation of Islam. So I really look forward to the discussion on the Middle East. It's a really important topic because I think you see this narrative today again of end the endless wars and this view that our disengagement from the region is an unmitigated good. So, Joel, welcome. I know that I know that the students here are really anxious to hear from you, and I look forward to hearing your remarks. And then, just a reminder to everybody as you listen to Joel, think about your questions, please, and enter those questions in the question and answer function. I'll review those and try to compress them and get as many to Joel and to have a discussion based on your questions after Joel's remarks. So, Joel, welcome. Great to see you.
All right, it's my pleasure, General McMaster. My pleasure to be with some folks from American University. My family in recent years has been very closely associated with another fine institution of higher learning that's located adjacent to American University, and I'm speaking, of course, of Horace Mann Elementary School. Since my family lives about 2 blocks south of American University. And I want to say one of the most impressive things I've learned about American University is that there are a large number of high quality Pokemon Go objectives all located throughout the American University campus. So I have nothing but respect for AU and its students. Today, I want to talk, keep continuing General McMaster's theme about the Middle East and the idea of disengagement. I think what we find in U.S. policy concerning the Middle East is every new U.S. administration that comes into office comes in with the idea that the Middle East is a place that's pretty with conflicts that are intractable, and each administration has the goal of trying to extricate itself from involvement in the Middle East, usually in favor of some other region that looks better. Lately that's been the Pacific. I think in decades past that was also the Western Hemisphere. But you find every administration finds over its course in office that it's not so easily extricated from the Middle East. The Middle East, if you try to extricate yourself from the Middle East tends to reach out and pull you back in. And that's for some key reasons. First is that it's important in a lot of different ways. Most clearly, the Middle East is important for the energy that's required to fuel the global economy. Something between 20 and 25% of the world's energy supply, fossil fuel energy supply, comes from the Persian Gulf region. And that's going to be true for a long time now. And even as the US has become an energy exporter rather than importer, the rest of the global economy that the US interacts with is largely dependent or a great deal of it, is dependent on Middle Eastern fuel, Middle Eastern energy. That includes Europe and the Far East. So the European Union that our economy interacts with closely, the economies of the Far East that we interact with closely, they're dependent on the Middle East. So if we want to have viable allies and trading partners in those regions, then the Middle East has to matter. It also matters because the Middle East has been an engine of jihadism really since 1967, since the failure of the Arab states in the Six-Day War of 1967. Political Islam has been viewed as a potential alternative to the system of Arab states, and Islamism and then violent jihadism have followed along in train. And if you try to so jihadism doesn't exist because we have a presence in the Middle East. Jihadism is expansionist, and if you try to extricate yourself from the Middle East in the hope of not offending the jihad movement is going to follow you out of the Middle East anyway. So you're much better at trying to deal with much better off trying to deal with the problem at its root. The Middle East also in recent years has been a scene of interstate conflict and great power competition, and that's something that we have a stake in as well. I can give you more details on that as I've witnessed them over the last few years, if you're interested. The northern Middle East in particular is an unstable region. It's been prone to instability. I'm talking about the region south of Anatolia, but between the Mediterranean Sea and the Zagros Mountains. These are what were the Arabic-speaking provinces of the Ottoman Empire that fell out of Ottoman control after the First World War. And that region has been sort of casting about for a stable political model ever since the fall of the Ottoman Empire. They haven't really found one yet. That's one of the roots of instability in that region. But right now is particularly turbulent time, maybe the most turbulent since the fall of the Ottoman Empire. You have more than 80 million people, by my rough estimate, living between the Mediterranean and the Zagros Mountains, for whom the future is uncertain. They live in states. They're not sure what the future of those states is going to be. They're not sure what the future of their communities within those states are going to be. Until really recently, it wasn't clear that Iraq was going to hold together as a polity. It's still not clear for the long term. And so people living in Lebanon, people living in Syria, people living in Iraq, people living in kind of the loosely governed spaces in and amongst those states, they aren't sure what their political future looks like. They aren't sure. I don't think you could get many of them to bet a lot of money on the idea that 10 years from now, the state in which they're living is still going to exist, or at least exist within its current borders or as is currently defined. So it's a really uncertain time, and that causes people, when people are in an uncertain age, it leads them to hedge their bets for safety by falling back on communal identities, sectarian identities, and so on. And that helps to that unfortunately exacerbates the regional sectarian conflict that General McMaster was referring to. Some of those states are extremely important just on their own merit. They would be important states if they had the characteristics that they do if you picked them up out of the Middle East and put them down somewhere else. Iraq, a lot of people in America, as General McMaster and I witnessed, as a lot of people who were in Iraq have witnessed, Americans would just sooner forget Iraq. It was the scene of a war that was quite unpopular for a lot of Americans, and they just as soon think of Iraq in the rearview mirror. But Iraq is a country that has almost 40 million people. It's on top of probably the world's second or third largest proven oil reserves. So it's an incredibly important energy producer. And it's the scene of a very intense struggle with the Iranian regime, between the Iraqi people and the Iranian regime, and between the influence of the West and the influence of the Iranian regime. So it's going to continue to be an important zone just on its own merits. Another reason that the Middle East tends to be more important, to take on kind of a heightened importance, is that because we've been engaged there for as long as we have, really dating back to the creation of the Carter Doctrine. The Carter Doctrine is a doctrine that just basically just says what happens in the Middle East is important to our interests, to U.S. interests, and so we should apply ourselves according to our interests. People around the world are watching for what we do in the Middle East, and it has a signal effect on how we would confront crises elsewhere. For example, I think when President Trump ordered airstrikes against the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria after Assad's forces had used chemical weapons, everyone around the world was watching that, including North Korea. It was an example of the Trump administration being willing to hold the state accountable for its actions, and it wasn't lost on anyone. So people around the world look in different zones. They look at how we behave in the Middle East as a signal of how we might behave in a crisis in their own region. Within the Middle East, I think people over the last couple of decades been a bit baffled by our decisions. The fact that we involve ourselves in the Middle East, but then we're constantly talking about wanting to get uninvolved in the Middle East or disengaged from the Middle East. So I think the people of the Middle East and the governments of the Middle East feel like, our friendly governments anyway, feel like we're constantly spinning them like a top, or we're spinning like a top. A little confused about where our interests lie. That's understandable when you're involved in an extended conflict. It's understandable for fatigue to set in, especially if you can't remember why it is you're involved in those conflicts, or if your leadership doesn't do the work of continuing to explain why these places matter, or if you have leaders who, for some reason, don't think these places matter, and then you're drawn in, you're drawn out, and so on, without really attaching it explicitly to national interests. But for sure now, one of the major problems confronting the United States and our allies in the Middle East is the fact that you have an expansionist Iranian regime that is trying to project military power into the Arab world in an unprecedented way, at least an unprecedented way in modern times. You'd have to go back, I think, to the Safavid Empire, or maybe even a little sooner, to find an example of Persian military influence being felt that deeply into the Arab world. The Iranian regime's representatives in their messaging in the Arab world have boasted in recent years of controlling 4 Arab capitals. They mean Baghdad, Damascus, Beirut, and Sana'a. Now, whether they actually control them or not, well, that's up for debate, but that's certainly the message. The message that they want to send is that the Iranian military influence is here. There's a new Persian Empire, so to speak, and the dreamers in the Revolutionary Guards Corps, the dreamers who run the Revolutionary Guards Corps, certainly have some big ambitions in the Middle East, and they run up against our interests and our friends' interests quite quickly. I should add, so this is a bit ex post facto, but I should add that the disclaimer that I'm speaking today on my own behalf. I'm not speaking for anyone here in the U.S. Senate where I'm working now, nor anyone in the military where I was associated. So these are my thoughts. However, having said that, I do want to cite something that my Senator Bill Hagerty from Tennessee wrote recently. He laid out a prudent approach as he sees it for what we should do in the Middle East, and really it's a regional strategy that could apply anywhere. It's pretty simple, boiled down to its basics. First, where our adversaries are acting against our interests, we should counter them using various means. That doesn't mean war necessarily. Sometimes it might, you might have to use the tools of war, as President Biden just used in Syria against an Iranian-sponsored militia that had been involved in attacks against our people. But most of the time, it doesn't mean war, but it does mean pushing back. It means pushing back with various tools that you have, whether that's military tools, economic tools, political or diplomatic tools, informational tools, and so on. I would say law enforcement tools too, in my experience. The second principle is where you have allies and partners that share your interests, back up your allies and partners and show that you're committed to them, and show that you will defend them from attacks by your common adversaries. That's something that's necessary in the Middle East right now too, because we have a lot of friends in the Middle East who are under assault from the Iranian regime and its proxies in particular. And the third principle is where there are conflicts, seek to resolve the conflicts, seek to get a peaceful outcome to the conflicts but on our terms, on terms that are favorable to us and our allies. Don't just seek a resolution for resolution's sake, because if you just do that, then you wind up doing, it would be easy, for example, to get some outcomes to the conflicts in the Middle East on Iran's terms, or on Russia's terms, or on Hezbollah's terms, but those are terms that are favorable to us. So just pretty simply, we should seek to resolve conflicts on our terms. I think that's what the Abraham Accords are a great example of. They're resolving, I would say, a sort of a dormant conflict between Israel and the Arab states, a lot of the Arab states, but they're resolved on peaceful terms that favor us and our allies. And it so happens that we wind up having allies on both sides of that conflict. So the fact that we're helping to broker resolutions of those conflicts between our friends, that's the best kind of outcome of all. Let me talk briefly about why the most eloquent arguments for disengaging from the Middle East in the past couple of decades have been couched in the term realism. That with the narrative that the United States is engaged in the Middle East with unrealistic expectations, unrealistic goals, and what is more realistic is to disengage from the Middle East and to either retrench, as General McMaster has talked about, by just coming home, getting our own house in order, and only then will we look to project, virtuous power around the world, or that we will shift our focus to other areas that we're more interested in, whether that's the Indo-Pacific or somewhere else. These arguments, these ideas that are couched as realism are actually unrealism. They're so realistic that they're unrealistic. And why? Because it's all very well to want to extricate ourselves from a conflict, extricate ourselves from a war. I mean, who doesn't? I mean, war is horrible. Then Colonel McMaster got rocketed in Diwania one day. That wasn't very fun. So, who wants to keep doing that year after year after year? The problem is, at the strategic level, the war doesn't end when we leave. Because most of the time, vast majority of the time, people who are fighting in the conflict aren't really fighting because we're there. They're fighting for their own political objectives. And they don't just wake up and say, the Americans are gone. Okay, well, I guess the war's over. A war only happens if America's in it. So we'll lay down our arms and the war will subside. I don't know that that's ever happened. Nor, for example, when the Russians withdrew from Afghanistan, that wasn't the end of the Afghanistan war either. That war has never stopped. So the same is true. The same is true in the Middle East. The conflicts that are going on around the Middle East don't stop when we leave. This is what we had to relearn after we withdrew from Iraq in 2011. We turned around and we had to go back into Iraq just 3 years later, because Daesh had taken over a third of the country and was setting up an extremist so-called caliphate. Having conquered Mosul a city of 2 million people that's considered one of the capitals of the Arab world. So the war goes on. Strangely, that the warring parties have their own aims, and they keep warring, whether we're there or not. So we have to keep that in mind. So rather than just make decisions on to be involved or not be involved in conflict zones or in crises based on whether we're tired or not, or based on whether we feel like it or not, you have to have a very cold assessment of where our interests lie. And if our interests lie in shaping the outcome of a conflict, maybe decisively shaping the outcome of a conflict, then unfortunately you're going to have to remain involved in that conflict, even past the point of fatigue. Also, bear with me here. We're a little pressed for space in the basement of the Senate, so my space is not necessarily my own here. I would say there are a few things now that let me touch on, and then I'll stop and we'll take your questions or comments about American power. It's I could open up foreign policy periodicals every day and probably find half a dozen columns, op-eds, or articles about how we need to be realistic about the limits of American power. Okay, that's fine. You shouldn't get into any kind of conflict or crisis overestimating your own strength. But I would say that we've been treated to so much of that thinking over the last 20 years, or maybe further, probably since the end of the Cold War, that we have an unrealistic idea of American strength, of our capacity. And I think we, as a rule, thinkers and those who are writing about it, many practitioners, systematically underestimate they underestimate American power, and so they act in diplomacy and they act in crises as though we're weaker than we are. I think historically this has been the case for the last couple of decades. Well, for sure, we don't want to overestimate ourselves, but it's a grave mistake to underestimate our power relative to other actors, and to act as they're stronger than they are. General McClellan, at the beginning of his Peninsula campaign, which was a campaign in 1862 to try to capture Confederate capital of Richmond, was stymied at Yorktown as the Confederate General Jeb Magruder marched his 12,000 or so troops around in a circle. And McClellan's people would just kept counting. Oh my God, there's about 100,000 Confederates defending Yorktown. We can't possibly attack because we're at a disadvantage. When in reality, the Union Army outnumbered Magruder's troops probably by 6 or 7 or 8 to 1. General McMaster would maybe have the exact data on that, since he taught military history and I didn't. So, but I think systematically we overestimate our adversaries, and that's a danger. You don't want to underestimate your adversaries, certainly, but we're not in that zone right now, especially with respect to middle powers like the Iranian regime, and the fact that we're a superpower, but we often don't behave with the knowledge that we are, baffles people in the Middle East. I think it baffles people everywhere, but I think in particular in the Middle East, because the people of the Middle East are particularly attuned to the exercise of power, and they're constantly having to seek in any given crisis which party is the stronger, so that they can hedge toward the strong. When we're analyzing a conflict or analyzing a crisis, we have to keep things in perspective. We have to remember that most actors in a conflict or a crisis are relatively weak. And some of them are relatively extremely weak relative to us. That's true in just about any conflict. I would say my experience as a diplomat and as a military person before that is that the United States will always be a major factor in any situation or crisis or conflict, just if we decide to be. Even if in a given conflict or crisis, the resources that we have at our disposal are small, our capacity is so vast that as soon as we become involved, all the other actors in that particular crisis or situation immediately have to take note when we signal our involvement and when we signal our resolve to get a particular outcome in a crisis or a conflict. It has a huge impact on everyone else who's involved in that crisis. In order to bring those kind of effect to fruition, you have to have a very high level of diplomatic energy, and you have to work very hard to try to synchronize your diplomacy with everything else that you're doing, whether it's military operations or economic sanctions or public diplomacy or law enforcement activities, and that's very hard. The U.S. government is a big, unwieldy, bureaucratic monster, and it's very, very difficult to get your arms all the way around it and to try to synchronize everything that's happening on a particular situation. I would say it's really impossible. So you just have to try to set up a system to be able to do it as best you can. But I think the most important thing in trying to get a positive outcome and to synchronize diplomacy with everything else that we're doing is that you have to out-hustle your competition. You have to out-hustle your adversaries in particular, who are doing their best to try to get their political objectives out of a crisis or a conflict. As a diplomat, I found that I had to be constantly on the move, and I had to constantly be visible in being on the move. I had to try to be in more places than my competitors, the Russians, for example, or our adversaries, the Iranians, could be, and to try to keep them on the back foot so that they were having to react to what I was doing, or what my colleague Ambassador Jim Jeffrey was doing on Syria all the time. Zoom and WhatsApp and invisible meetings aren't enough. They have their place, but there's no substitute for being able to actually go to a conflict zone or a crisis zone or region and be visible on the ground with people who are making decisions. Diplomacy has to be operational in the same way that DoD's national defense strategy has to be operational. But it's very clear there. You deploy military forces across the globe. Well, you have to think of your diplomatic assets in the same way. HR, why don't I stop there? I could, keep on droning on forever, but I'm more interested in what questions people have.
Hey, Joel, that was just a tremendous rundown. We have some great questions already, and Paul and Tyler asked related questions, really involving, hey, what is it we're trying to achieve? Like, what are the goals in the Middle East? One of the questions was couched in the framework of, okay, when do we get to withdrawal? I would just say initially, withdrawal, I don't think is what we want to do as an end in of itself, because we want to remain obviously diplomatically engaged, and we want to be working with partners militarily, because it is actually for example, it was Iraqi forces who bore the brunt of the fight, or Syrian defense forces who bore the brunt of the fight against ISIS, and we enabled them. But Joel, could you share with Paul, Tyler, and those who are with us today, what is success? What does success look like in the Middle East?
Okay, first of all, the overwhelmingly most important goal, I'll say the overwhelming most significant national interest that we have concerning not just the Middle East, but any region, is securing the U.S. homeland. Securing the U.S. homeland. You can carry that farther and secure our necessary presence in other regions and help secure our allies and partners. But all of that is just done in order to do the first. Those are just supporting to the first. So you have to secure the U.S. homeland against threats to the U.S. homeland. So I would say one of the things that we're trying to do in the Middle East is to neutralize the threats to the U.S. homeland. That comes most significantly right now. It comes from very clearly the terrorist threat that comes from the region-wide and beyond jihadist movement, the violent Islamist movement that's typified by ISIS and Al Qaeda and groups like that. But secondly, and on a co-equal basis, is the threat that comes from the Iranian regime, which is every day trying to seek ways to do damage to us and our interests. Okay, so I think what we're trying to achieve in the Middle East in terms of securing the homeland is to neutralize those two threats to the U.S. homeland. To do the things that are required, use your different lines of operation under diplomatic lines of operation, economic, military, informational, law enforcement, so as to neutralize those two major threats to the security of the U.S. homeland. I would say the second overarching national interest that the United States has in the Middle East is to see the free flow of commerce, especially energy related commerce, and the free flow of shipping through strategic waterways. So the Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Suez Canal. I mean, these are strategic waterways that the international economy that we participate in, that is the root of our American prosperity. We rely on the free flow of commerce, especially energy supplies, through those waterways. So I think it has to do with the security of the American homeland and the prosperity of the American people, because of the Middle Eastern region's importance to our own economic interests. So on that second one, I think the objectives have to be to protect the energy source and to protect those strategic waterways against threats that would either try to disrupt them, destroy them, or control them and use them as a weapon against us, which is one of the things that the Iranian regime would like to do. The Iranian regime, I think, would like to control all of the energy production of the Middle East, and they would like to be able to militarily control at least the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb, and therefore sort of sit militarily astride the choke points going in both directions from the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, so that they could sit astride militarily the energy route to Europe that Europe relies upon, and from the Strait of Hormuz going over to East Asia. So I think if you could then, based on what I've just said, the questioner could really just brainstorm then what are the sub-objectives, what needs to happen in order to secure those two major national interests. Everything else is kind of corollary. I mean, we have some values-based interests, for example, that aren't geographically bounded. We have the example of the Holocaust in the last century. That's important for us because of it's trying to support the value, a universal value against crimes against humanity, against large-scale atrocities. These are in our interest because if that becomes the norm, then look at the damage it does in the world, and there's no way it doesn't spill over and eventually become a danger to our interests or to our friends. So that's happening in the Middle East. Verging on genocide in some places. And if genocide and mass murder, whether it's by non-state actors or by state actors, becomes a norm, becomes just sort of an accepted norm, then you can expect that example will proliferate around the world. So we've had a strong interest, I think, in trying to prevent that sort of behavior.
And Joel, I'm thinking of the great display that the Holocaust Museum put on about the Syrian civil war, and
Right.
and the mass murders and executions and the use of chemical agents to commit mass murder against innocents. Along these lines, there's a great framing of a question from Tyler here. He said, what is the relationship between hate and terrorism? And how do we defeat it? How do we defeat hate and terrorism? And I think I like the framing because I tend to think of of jihadist terrorism as driving a cycle of ignorance that is used to foment hatred, and then hatred that is used to justify violence against innocents. And of course, that violent environment, there's nobody getting
Yeah.
educated. The young people are susceptible to the demagoguery, brainwashing of terrorist organizations. And then, and I also wonder if, in the context of this, you might comment on Pope Francis's visit to Iraq, and which I think, who knows how much good that did. I think a tremendous amount of good. And where are we in breaking the cycle of hatred, and how do you see terrorism ending? How do you see us defeating this scourge?
Okay, so terrorism's never going to end because it's a tactic. So what you can do, you can neutralize and defeat a particular terrorist movement. So the jihadist movement across the greater Middle East, you have to attack it on two levels. You have to attack it physically, materially. For example, an ISIS caliphate cannot be left to exist and consolidate power to become a quasi-state that exhibits the elements of state power, like being able to tax people, conscript people, govern people, and so on. You cannot let a terrorist organization do that. So you have to attack it physically, which is why it was so important, and it still is important, to have the campaign against the ISIS caliphate, and now against the remnants of ISIS. But the second thing you have to do at the same time, it does no good just to attack it physically if you're not going to also try to attack its ideology and to try to show the bankruptcy of its ideas. This is so you have to attack it on the level of ideas as well. And these two go in tandem, because at least they do in the Middle East, because no one in the Middle East wants to be on the losing end of anything. And people in the Middle East are very attuned at following power, at gauging where power lies, and they don't like to be in a losing camp. So if you can marry an exposure of the bankruptcy of an ideology along with the destruction of the terrorist organization or whatever organization that's using the ideology, and therefore exposing the practitioners of the ideology as weak, as materially weak, that has a big effect. That's what we saw happen to Al-Qaeda in Iraq from 2006 to 2008. When they started losing, then suddenly people discarded their ideology, and they realized, okay, yeah, you guys are talking a lot of of nonsense, because you must not be favored by God because you're losing, and that was pretty demonstrative.
Hey, Joel, I think we might only have time for just one more question, and I want to thank Anissa for this question. She's listening in from the great city of Philadelphia, at Swarthmore College. So, she asks, is this talk about a post-war on terrorism, the retrenchment movement, is this a form of what she termed generational amnesia, right? And if it is, what does the younger generation need to know about the nature of this competition, and why it's important for us to remain engaged with the region, to learn about the conflicts and the opportunities in the region, and to remain engaged, as you mentioned, not just militarily, but diplomatically, and from an economic development perspective, and from, certainly, as we've been discussing, the humanitarian perspective as well.
Okay, that's an excellent question. I've been thinking about this a lot myself lately, and I think part of what we're experiencing in the West is that people who are now leading in public life, we've gotten to the point where they're mostly people without an active memory, or let's say an adult memory, of the Cold War, and certainly the height of the Cold War. So I think they've forgotten what it feels like to have peer adversaries, peer enemies that are using every tool of their national power to try to destroy your entire way of life. And so the Cold War was a pretty vast majority of people were under no illusions in the Cold War. It's whatever was going on in London or Paris or Rome or Washington D.C. or Kansas City was not as bad as what was happening behind the Iron Curtain, for example, or in Cambodia. So it was pretty good. And no one, I don't think, people during the Cold War, I don't think were morally confused. We're not morally confused about what was at stake. I think now people are. People are somewhat there, whether that's cultural relativism or whatever. But I do think it's having in post 1989 just we've gotten so distant from that, thankfully, but so distant from that we've forgotten how to recognize a rising threat to our way of life, to our interests in our way of life. And I think it would do for young people to study the Cold War and especially the war of ideas that took place during the Cold War, so that people they can realize, when you're talking about the Iranian regime or Bashar al-Assad or Russia, you don't have to be ashamed of what the United States is or what the United States stands for. There's absolutely no comparison. That's the first thing. I think also young people would do well to study Winston Churchill, especially during his wilderness years before the Second World War, when he was the champion really for the Western democracies, but he was many times alone. But the words, I recently read Andrew Roberts's biography of Churchill, which is pretty masterly, and I was struck over and over again hearing Churchill's words and seeing just how perfectly they described the moments that we're in now. So I would say that in order to repair generational amnesia is go back and look at the Cold War and go back and look at Churchill.
Okay, so I would say hashtag predictable, right, for that answer, because I'm a historian as well, right? And I do believe that really understanding how the past produced the present is the best way to begin thinking about the future. And there are so many, I think, lessons that we can learn from the competition, in the Cold War. It's not perfectly, it's not going to be a perfect analogy ever, right, Joel? But I think it can help us ask the right questions. And I think importantly, as you alluded to, it can help us understand better who we are and what is worth defending, right? And these days, Joel, as we emerge from these quadruple crises, of a pandemic, a recession associated with the pandemic, the social divisions and anger over inequality of opportunity and treatment under the law that we saw after George Floyd's murder, and now this vitriolic political season and the assault on the Capitol. I mean, we do have kind of a crisis of confidence, right? But when I engage with our younger generation, like those who are on here, it bolsters my confidence. I think that we should be more confident as Americans, and your message has been really strong in that connection. Joel, you've had an extraordinary career. The last question I'll pose to you, and then we'll have to end, is any advice you have for our students at not just American University, but broadly, about the rewards of service, the opportunities to serve, just any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I don't have any regrets. I think that being in military service, as you and I were, the military is a great leveler. You see people from all walks of life. So I think being in public service, and I know that's true in other institutions too. So I think being in public service keeps you close to the heartbeat of the people. For me, coming from the middle of the country, and having that upbringing, I think has kept me grounded. So I value that. But I also have valued in the course of military service and then in diplomatic service, being able to represent America abroad, and being and I it was such a great honor for me to be the face of the United States in dealing with foreign counterparts, and trying to live and to treat them straightforwardly, and as a representative of my country. I mean, there was just there was no higher honor than that. And also the feeling, it's a pretty awesome feeling. I don't mean it in kind of the the California sense awesome, but the surfing sense awesome. But I mean, in awe-inspiring, I'm filled with awe to be just former military person from Oklahoma City, who now, though, because I'm the representative of the United States, when I go into a particular situation, I'm being treated with the deference that the United States gets. I mean, it's very humbling, but it gives you a sense of obligation and responsibility. It forces you to grow up a little bit, to the extent that that's possible for somebody like you or me.
Hey, Joel, I can't thank you enough. What a great session. I think our students will agree. And I'll just say in concluding, that one of the greatest aspects of service is the great honor and privilege of serving with amazing people like you, with just great Americans who care deeply about our country and all humanity, and do their best every day to build a better future for generations to come. And part of this conversation we've had it with Megan Badish and Fiona Hill and Lisa Curtis, and our next discussion is with American University graduate Ilber Bajraktari.
Yeah.
Who was, and we all worked together. The three of us worked together very closely in Iraq years ago. But it's that kind of fellowship, and that comradeship, and that'll be on March 23rd with Ilber. So any words of introduction you want to say for Ilber, and then we'll end there, Joel?
So Ilber was, when he's been in the Defense Department, he's not in the Defense Department right now, but Ilber was the smartest man inside the Defense Department. Yeah. And it was, but it was unknown except to the people at the very top of the Defense Department. Well, for me, I got in a pattern of whenever, after I worked with Ilber in Baghdad, we shared a cubicle in the Republican Palace, and went on many helicopter journeys together. But whenever I would start a new job, especially difficult ones, I would immediately figure out how to get Ilber to come and do the actual work. I'd say, oof, what have I gotten myself into? Okay, the first thing is Ilber, where are you?
No, it's so true. He is one of the most capable people I've ever met in my life. Extraordinary. Yes. So
I pulled Ilber to 3 different assignments that I had.
Which is what I did with you, and it was a ripple effect. That's what happened. Hey, Joel, I can't thank you enough. I'm sure the students enjoyed the conversation. I enjoyed it immensely. Thanks to all of you who joined us. Thanks especially to Lindsay and Olivia for helping put this on, and thanks to the Sign Institute for this tremendous opportunity to be with all of you. Joel, thanks so much. Thanks for your continued service to our country now on the Senate staff, and it was great to see you. Take care.
Great to see you as well.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.